We are almost halfway through the third year of a class called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. And this is supposedly an advanced level astrological technique course, at least advanced in my eyes, which is not the same as other people because there are some very technical astrologers out there. But it is meant to be as much of a class on mysticism and psychology because they are all three parts of a total of a human being. Now, so far in these 2.5 years, we have recapitulated everything from the courses that come before this course. We went through all the elementary things and did all the tests and such, and now we're ready to begin new things. Now, in this recapitulation, we have been using the horoscopes of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And we have also been comparing relatively similar things, methods and concepts and things like that, that are used in astrology, that are used in the psychologies of Freud and Jung. We do a little bit of that with regard to mysticism, but we haven't done a lot yet. We're now just about ready to go more deeply into all of these things, astrology, psychology, and mysticism. But before we can do that, we have to have an intermezzo. And the intermezzo is that in this talk and the next talk, we're going to talk about psychic health. When a person is sane, when a person is insane, and where and how and why problems develop. And we're going to talk about it from the viewpoint of mysticism. And then next semester, when we start the second half of the year, we'll return to the astrology. I'm of such an age now that most would call me a senior citizen. And most of the aspects of maturing are very pleasant. And among those positives is self-knowledge. If someone lives with oneself long enough, one is bound to get to know oneself better without even trying. And if you're trying, it's even a lot more. Even unpleasant experiences lead to self-knowledge, whether we like it or not. Sometimes it seems like the unpleasant experiences are more productive of self-knowledge than the pleasant things. And that's the way it is when we're unenlightened as we are. Now, for example, I have found in myself for many years now a tendency to be impatient. Things should happen immediately, especially for somebody as important as I am. They should happen right away. And in my impatience, I try to force things. And the result is almost always injury, and sometimes serious injury. And the pain of learning that force is no substitute for finesse doesn't end right in the moment. Some of it lingers on, and it returns throughout life. If you've got a bad knee, it's going to come up again and again and again. So these pains are reminders of character flaws. And you might say that the sins of youth are visited on the aged. So, these aches and pains remind me that I need to live a life of finesse over force and never try to force anything. And they're going to continue to do that as long as I'm in this physical body, especially since in some ways I am a pretty slow learner. Now, that example is more psychological than physical, but the principle applies to physical things also. For example, one could go through life without knowing that one has a kidney until a kidney stone comes along, and then one becomes keenly aware that there is a kidney. It's when something goes wrong that you know what was there right all the while. There's probably a character cause behind kidney stones, just as there are behind injuries from using force. But at this point, we're just focusing on the awareness and not necessarily a specific lesson. Our bodies are our creations. And the quality of the functioning of our bodies is our creative feedback. If something doesn't work right, it means we didn't create it right. So with creation, it is a matter of art. And it is often said that the best art is invisible. It's invisible in such a way that the beauty shines through in such a way that you don't even notice the artifice. You don't even notice the skill. I like listening to string quartets. And I like listening to string quartets more than listening to symphonies. The reason is I like to know everything that's going on. And I can hear all four parts of a string quartet, but I can't hear everything that's going on in a symphony. But if you listen to a really good string quartet like somebody from Foray or somebody like that, it's like sitting there and looking through a picture window at a beautiful landscape. But if you listen to a string quartet like Beethoven, it's the same thing, only there's no glass in the window. Beethoven is so clear. It's complete transparency. Now, the example of a kidney stone is good to indicate awareness, but it does raise questions. One of those questions is, should we even be aware of all body functioning? We are spiritual beings, and we use our bodies to experience and create in the physical world. And a conscious awareness of this functioning may not be necessary to that. It may even be distracting. So there are no final answers to that, but usually in questions of that nature, I usually come down on the side of conscious awareness. Eventually, we will be aware of everything that goes on within us and in the world around us. Roughly speaking, that's the way it is to God. Everything is aware in the universal spirit. So long as we don't get lost in the minutiae, it's all right to be aware of everything. Eventually, it is our duty to know what's going on in ourselves. Now, in this talk, we're interested in when we cannot function and we cannot know that we cannot function. That's a pretty sad business. We know, for example, if we lose a limb, that there are some things we can't do. And if one is blind or deaf, there is a lot about the world that we can't experience. But to me, The greatest disability is when we have come to a state or when we come to something that we cannot know. It's painful to go and visit someone in a hospital and you see people suffering. Why me? Why is this happening to me? But you know that if they ponder their situation and listen for an internal answer to that question, why me, you know that they can learn why it happened to them. It's much, much more painful to visit a mental hospital because somebody in the mental hospital cannot know. They've lost that ability. Even intoxication or idiocy is painful to see. There are people who say ignorance is bliss, but it's not for anyone who has once seen the glories that people are ignorant of. Now, we're aspirants to the mysteries. And in one of the ancient Greek mystery schools, on the lintel of the door, it was chiseled in stone, words that are very dear to us. Gnothi se auton. Know thyself. And if someone is impaired from self-knowledge, that's about as sad as it gets. What we're going to try to do, or what we would like to do in this talk, is to use this technique of awareness through malfunction to arrive at an understanding of insanity. And from there, to jump to sanity. If we know what happens when something isn't working, then we can understand how it is supposed to work when it does function, when it does work. Now, with psychic health, it's a lot different than physical health, and there are a lot of reasons why it is more difficult. There are problems of many different kinds. One of those problems is that unless one is a very well-trained and skilled clairvoyant, one cannot know the subject matter. In the physical world, we can see the liver, and we can measure all of its activities and products, but most people can't see the desire body, for example. We can even experiment with the kidneys or liver, but you can't do that, at least not very well, with the etheric vital body. All we can do in our material blindness is to infer from psychic manifestations as they change things in the physical world. And that's exactly what Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung did. Their inferences from psychic conditions were accurate enough so that they could relieve neuroses. But their biases and their limitations prohibited them from coming to a deeper and more thorough understanding such as we have for mysticism. Now, another problem in this is that self-awareness and self-diagnosis are difficult. And they're impossible with insanity. Again, if you have a kidney stone, you know it. And you hie to the doctor as quickly as you possibly can. Now, one may or may not know if one has a neurosis. Then there is resistance to psychological treatment that is due to ignorance about psychology or to social stigma. Furthermore, many people are against the drug therapy that they're likely to encounter. I have never yet met a mental patient that felt good about the drugs that they had to take to keep themselves in the body. Self-diagnosis of psychosis or insanity is just about impossible because one has lost that ability to know. Most, perhaps all, psychotics do not think there's anything wrong with them. That's something I've almost never seen a psychotic that really knew what was wrong with them. In fact, very often, many of the psychotics will adamantly and fervently deny any suggestion of a problem. It's almost the case that if someone is capable of doubting or does doubt their sanity, that person is probably pretty sane. If you're capable of doubting and you can see yourself in that light, that's a sign of sanity. But the converse is not true. There are people who are sure of their sanity because they are sane. So the converse doesn't work out. Now, in everyday language, the definition of sanity or insanity is all about rationality. If an individual is sane, that individual is rational. And if the person is irrational, that person is insane. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that definition. For example, one might ask, does that mean if somebody is really stupid and cannot ratiocinate, are they insane? And some people would say that. And that answer can't be dismissed outright. Now, I have friends who are raising a Down syndrome child. And both rationality and sanity are weak in that child. This would mean that sanity or insanity are a matter of degree. In short, one can be a little crazy. That kind of thinking leads to. If we look in courts of law, and the professionals that are psychologists or psychiatrists that testify in courts of law, they do have they have difficulty declaring sanity or insanity. And what it eventually comes down to is the person responsible for themselves for what they have done, or does that person present a clear and present danger to themselves or to others? That's not an easy judgment to come to. We've seen that recently where people who have been released with mental problems, then go out and shoot a bunch of people. Now, one weakness of determining sanity by rationality is exposed by asking a question like, if someone is highly rational, say like a logician or somebody like that, does that mean they're more sane? Do they have a better rational or waking judgment of reality? That doesn't hold up, Because there are a lot of people that are seemingly rational and that are brilliant and are testable. But they do present a clear and distinct danger to themselves and to society. Now, when we start talking about rationality, it brings us to talking about talk. And it brings into question what psychiatrists call crazy talk. Crazy talk is seemingly meaningless speech. Some call it psychobabble, some call it delusional rant, but crazy talk is the most common term for it. Now, it is to the credit of both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung that they realized that crazy talk is not meaningless and it is not untrue. It may not address facts of the world the way people look at the world, but that doesn't mean that it's untrue. Very often it's a matter of context and or purpose. Someone in their consciousness can be so bound up in petty little things that, and addressing all their consciousness to that they lose awareness or a sense of proportion to life in general. So that's a matter of context. They're taking life out of context and looking at petty little things. Sometimes crazy talk is not meaningless at all. It's just not direct. Its purpose is something other than direct communication, even though it seems like direct communication. At one time, I worked with someone who was a classic paranoid schizophrenic. And this person wrote an over 1,000-page book on his encounters with ETs and the importance of his knowledge of and from them. This was someone that could run on at great length with all kinds of seemingly meaningless chatter, all kinds of inconsistency, everything else. But he was telling the truth. And the truth he was telling is not normally the way we judge truth. He was telling an indirect truth. And the way it turned out, which is common to paranoid types of people, is that he was saying that deep down inside of himself, he felt he was a worthless piece of crap. But if someone were to believe these fantastic things about him, they might befriend him, and then everything would be all right. It would be a way of redeeming himself through delusional glorification. The thing is, if someone did listen to him, the road might be long and difficult, but there would be a possibility of being brought back. But what usually happens is all of that is brushed off as crazy talk, and that's all just a symptom. It really is a symptom, but it's more than that to the patient. And when the patient is told that, and everything that the patient is saying is ignored, the patient closes up, because a bridge of trust has not been built. It's like saying, you don't believe me, so why should I cooperate with you? Even if the patient had the intent to cooperate in the first place because of suffering. That long, treacherous road to full recovery, if it is possible, is not socially possible. Because our society is not set up for healing people. There are very few qualified people who know how to bring somebody back. And we can't afford mass psychotherapy because we have all that weaponry we have to pay for. So what do? We use drugs that quiet them so that they aren't a bother, and we keep them passive and out of the way. Now, incidentally, as a footnote, it is not intended to imply that all ET talk is psychobabble. I don't mean that at all. Now, from our spiritually blind perspective here, in the exclusively outer chemical subdivision of the physical world, it is exceedingly difficult to determine sanity. There is what is called the DSM, which is the Manual of Diagnostic and Statistical Mental Disorders. It describes all kinds of categories and types of mental disorder, serious and or mild. And the descriptions are for psychiatrists and psychologists, people who work in that milieu. And the descriptions are very abstract and very terse, because that it has to be. It's a big, thick book. I've got a copy of it in the basement. In fact, I even got a copy of the book that you have to read to understand what the book is saying. It's sort of a dictionary of those terms. So it has to be that way, because you can't describe at length. Now, this kind of thing is both good and bad. On the bad side, it misses the human side of things. And from a spiritual point of view, human understanding and care are what are really necessary to bring someone back from that kind of a state. The term psychosis is still used in various ways, and new terms or different terms are used for different kinds of milder conditions. But you look in the DSM, and there is no mention of sanity or insanity. Now, if you look at things in terms of a graduated spectrum of physiological conditions, there are all kinds of, between someone being deeply disturbed to someone being pleasantly mild and in touch with the physical world or the external reality. It's a big spectrum. And psychology deals with that spectrum, and they don't define a difference between sanity and insanity. From a spiritual point of view, a mystical point of view, it is different than that. Mysticism has a clear and concise definition of insanity. Insanity is when the threefold spirit, the self, or the spiritual ego, cannot get to and through the dense physical personality. This also means at the same time that the spirit cannot bring back necessary information from the physical world and the other outer vehicles of consciousness into itself for processing, for knowing the truth of experience. Now, please note in these definitions that the word cannot is used. it is possible that the spirit can function through the chains of consciousness, but chooses not to. So the cannot doesn't apply there. There are people who choose not to come all the way through into reality, and it isn't insane. It's not that they can't do it, it's just that they don't want to or that they won't. So when we're talking about a break that cannot be bridged in the chain of consciousness, we're talking about an extremely serious condition. A condition that is so serious that advanced mystics claim insanity cannot be healed. This means that the spiritual being that is the subject or that is in an insane state has to wait until the next rebirth to come back with a new attuned set of vehicles. Now this has something to do with the fact that the vehicles of consciousness are resonantly attuned to each other, just like the spiritual worlds out of which those bodies are built. Those vehicles are made of the stuff of worlds, and those worlds are resonantly attuned to each other. But if you break that resonance, it is not possible to reinstitute it. You have to start all over from the beginning. This is the claim of very advanced spiritual seers who can follow people through many lives and in intricate and intimate observation inwardly. Now, this whole subject of resonance is a very interesting topic, and we can't go into it now. Later on, if I live that long and we get into cosmogony, we can look at it then. In fact, it's mandatory to do it then. Now, incurability is not foreign to regular psychologists and psychiatrists. They say a psychosis cannot be cured. It can be treated and it can be managed, but it cannot be cured. Now, at this point, it's important to recall something which was mentioned, but not necessarily with great emphasis, when we studied cosmography a few years ago. And it is the fact that each world has a character of its own, a basic character with various different expressions. The character of the physical world is massive. And that massiveness is the nature of it. And when we think about the physical body relative to the physical world, physical body is heavy to carry around. In spirit, we would just as soon fly off, and we recognize the massiveness of the physical body. So each body is composed of the stuff that has a character of its own. And the body itself, or the vehicle of consciousness, has a character of its own. And part of that character is due to the laws of the world out of which it is built. But another part of it is due to the creative proficiency of the spirit who built the body. And yet another part of it is that the character of the body depends on the subjective expression of the being that created it. We all have our style. For example, the etheric vital body moves the dense physical body, and it has to follow the principles of the ethers. If someone is not adept at etheric expression, is not fluent with it, the person may not move well. Now, if someone works on being in touch with etheric motion, they may utilize the principles of motion in such a way that they are using the flows of energy. They're working with it. And at the same time, each person might have a style. So you can see that each person has a style of moving. Dancers do this a lot. And with the dancer having a style, it's not just a matter of the structure of the body and the muscles. That is one factor. But it is about the style of addressing the body through the ethers. Now, we could say similar things about each of the vehicles of consciousness if there were enough time to do that and if it was germane to what we're talking about, but it really isn't, so we'll just keep passing on. When the spirit loses control of its vehicles, they begin to express their autonomy. That is, if we are not inside of our vehicles and directing them with our consciousness, they're going to go to an autonomous state. And this autonomy is especially noted between the self, the spirit, and the pseudo-self that is located in the desire body. And so when there is a big struggle and the self has not yet been able to assert itself over the lower nature, we have what is called a split personality. So we are spiritual aspirants, and we experience this battle. And we grow spiritually, we wake up, and we become more in control of our vehicles as we win this battle. In that, we awaken. And in our awakened consciousness, we are at present dealing with semi-autonomous components. Sometimes our bodies don't want to do what we want them to. Sometimes our concrete minds don't do what we want them to do. And so we are struggling to gain control over autonomy. That is why when we become spiritual aspirants and we want to wake up to our divine being and we want to be able to create and do what we want to do, when we do that, an inner war breaks out. It's on. The war is on. Now, this is another subject that I would love to go into and sometime have a sub-series on it, on the inner war, but right now it's not appropriate. It's just enough to know why there is such a dramatic difference and internal struggle in people who are having psychological problems. Now, it's painful to be in the dark, especially for us because we are seeking the light of spiritual truth. We have a tremendous advantage in the spiritual science that has been so generously given to us by those that are advanced beyond us. And we are blessed with intuition. And if we purify ourselves and learn to recognize it, we have a wondrous ability with intuition. And on top of that, we have astrology to help all of this. But when it comes to psychospiritual diagnosis, we're in the dark. We can intuit to some extent the nature of a problem, but basically we're in the dark. In order to diagnose and help psychological problems, it is necessary to be a skilled and trained clairvoyant. When we're talking about clairvoyance, we're not talking about some kind of a chancy psychic condition. We're talking about a controlled faculty. This is especially true when we're trying to determine if there is a rupture in the chain of consciousness. For example, if without clairvoyance, one cannot tell if there is a schizophrenic break, or whether the person is possessed. There was an associate, he was a young man when Freud was old, named Nandor Fodor. And he was a practicing psychoanalyst in New York City. And over the years, he came to learn that in some cases of schizophrenia, there was indeed spirit possession. Even though he didn't believe in spirits and spirit possession when he began, the evidence in his consciousness and awareness of what was going on was too strong. He did go overboard a little bit and was possession crazy for a few years back in the 70s, but hats off to somebody that comes to that in that way. Now, it is, looking at it in another way, it is a spiritual fact that every time we think or emote or desire, we produce a little wisp of thought or desire form. And these elemental bits of life come together. They coalesce according to the affinities they have, according to the way they're like each other. It's actually an astrological thing, and we'll get to that eventually. By habit and repeating the same kinds of thoughts and desires and emotions, we produce general inner world entities. Some of them are benign and some not so. These are the things that are the things that are meaningfully described as complexes or psychic constellations by the psychologists. Now, if the spirit becomes weak and passive, and the habits have been very strongly developed, those entities become autonomous. Sometimes habits, even habits in consciousness, become so strong that they act on their own. That's why it's good to assess your life every now and then to see if there are things that take over on their own or whether you're in control of everything. Now, if self-assertion becomes very weak and the autonomy becomes correspondingly strong, there may be a manifestation of these different constellations or complexes in what is called multiple personalities. However, we don't know from without whether that's really the case. It may very well be a case of multiple possession, such as Legion in the Gospels. Sometimes one develops a desire nature so strong and so set that the desire body becomes hardened. A person lives for desire and lives in that desire, and every time you give yourself into a desire like that, an indulgent desire especially, you harden yourself. You harden yourself physically, and you harden your desire body. And sometimes after death, the desire body is so hardened that passing through purgatory does not dissolve it. And so it hangs around. Sometimes it hangs around for thousands of years. The spirit goes on with the work in between lives, but these bodies are still hanging around in the desire world. They are often, or most often, called astral shells. Now suppose an individual has produced such an astral shell. Suppose that person comes back to birth, comes back with a new set of vehicles. And then at around puberty, when the desire body is awakened, the old desire body or old desire bodies come back to the original creator. They're attracted to it. And they struggle for control of the personality. And so the result is that there is all kinds of very mixed motivations, to say the least. And it appears as though a person has more than one personality. Now, in psychology, there is a condition that used to be called dementia precox, and it is now called juvenile schizophrenia. And it is it is a condition that comes on at puberty or in the few years thereafter. So this occurrence is something that is happening. Now, it takes a skilled clairvoyant to determine whether it is elementals within a person that are producing multiple personalities, or is it multiple possessions, or is it an assertion of astral shells, or is it some other cause? This is why, from without, you would see several different behaviors in the same person, and you would not be able to get at the cause. You have to have that clairvoyance. It has to be a controlled, well-trained clairvoyance. Mystics differentiate between clairvoyance and spiritual sight. And insight is an intuitive understanding that gives a quality of knowing. Clairvoyance is a quality of perceiving through a body of the world of which it is made, sensitized enough to see that body. For example, our eyes, we can see the physical world, and our eyes are of the stuff of the physical world. Desire world clairvoyance comes about if we attune our centers of sensitivity in our desire body. We can see things in the desire world. And spiritual sight, which is different from clairvoyance, is when intuition is teamed up with clairvoyance, so that you not only see something, you know what it means. Because without insight, clairvoyance can be quite baffling. Sometimes even with insight, it's baffling. At one time, I had a friend, a very dear friend, who dabbled in all sorts of occultism. And he was not inclined toward working. And he was always looking for shortcuts to get what he wanted without the necessary work to get it in a legitimate way. So he did all sorts of drugs and other agencies and was involved with all kinds of different lower occultism. And sometimes he had a lower grade of clairvoyance. And he looked up to me a lot. I loved him dearly, not because he looked up to me, but just there are some people that are friends, you know, you recognize that right away. And one day he came to me and said, I just saw a man with no aura. I thought that was impossible. So it had to be explained to him that what he had seen was a physical personality that was possessed. During life, the aura in desire world space that approximates the same space in three-dimensional physical space is an ovoid that extends 15, 18, sometimes even 24 inches outside the physical body. That's its nature, and all of the different feelings and desires flow through it, and it's changing all the time, just like our emotions are changing all the time. But what happens is, in the post-mortem panorama, when we view the pictures in the ethers, the essence of the structure of the dense physical and vital body get built into the desire body through the region of impressionability. And as that happens, the desire body assumes the shape of the dense physical body when it was alive. Now, suppose someone has passed through that panorama, and suppose that person knows the rules or the worlds of the desire world, the laws of them, and has enough will. That person, if they are willful and knowledgeable, can resist the purgatorial process. I don't know why anybody'd want to do it. You got to take your strokes because ultimately it's going to have to happen. But such a person, when they resist, they are free to do what they want to do. And a lot of them like to come back and make mischief in the physical world. And they love to have access in the physical world because they're earthbound. They're all their values. They don't think about heavens, or they don't think about divine truth or anything like that. They think about having a good time on earth. And so they're in their desire body, in the shape that their physical body used to be, and so they find somebody who is weak and sensitive. They frighten them or force them out of their body, and they take it over. When the rightful owner of the body has been dispossessed of it, the resulting entity would not have the auric body. There would be a desire body, but it would be within the physical body, and you wouldn't know, if you saw this, as my friend did, he saw this, and he didn't know what was going on because he didn't understand the principles of the spiritual worlds. If he had been a little more astute, and if his clairvoyance were better, if he'd have looked around, he would have seen an auric vehicle of the true owner of that body hovering around nearby saying, "Let me back." Yeah, I forgot to tell you, it's going to be a little long tonight. So the mystical view of insanity is that there is a complete break in a chain of consciousness between the spirit and the physical personality. Folk language doesn't disagree with this. We have all kinds of examples of it. If we see somebody that we say they're out of it, we say he or she is not all there, or we say he or she has lost his senses, or we say you can't get through to him. Or we say he's completely withdrawn. Or we say she's flipped out. Now, these are not precise statements, and they are not the result of a clear clairvoyance, but they do show some understanding that in the general folk consciousness there is somewhat of a sense of the situation. Now, it should be pretty obvious by now that this view and this definition of insanity is a very severe condition. It is also pretty much rare. As we said earlier, there's a large spectrum of states between sanity and insanity. Because of the extreme elasticity of the inner vehicles, some of the unhealthy states can be quite unusual. And they can be pretty severe, but they can be brought back. But it's never wise to declare someone insane. Because if they aren't, and they're near the brink, you could push them over. Besides, such a declaration doesn't do any good. It could save you a lot of energy if you were trying to redeem the person and it was impossible, but in order to do that, you'd have to be a pretty wise person in the first place. Now, before we look into sanity and spiritual hygiene, let's look at some samples of insanity. In doing this, please remember that the examples we're going to give are extremely gross and obvious examples. Usually it's much more subtle, and it takes a lot of work to come to a good understanding. Now, again, it has to be repeated that there are many states that approximate the states of insanity as we see it from without. You have to have conclusive knowledge to declare insanity. All right? If there is a break between the etheric vital body and the dense physical body, it is a condition called death. Obviously, this condition requires rebirth to reconnect with the chemical subdivision of the physical world. It's a strange way to look at death as insanity, but it's interesting to note that when the etheric vital body leaves, the physical body reverts back to the mineral kingdom. We call it rigor mortis. It lasts until the bacteria start getting in there, and then it really dissolves away. So this almost makes our definition of insanity seem absurd, but it does seem to indicate that we have to have a physical presence to be whole human beings. At this state in our evolution and the kind of evolution that we have chosen for ourselves, we are not a complete person if we haven't come to the physical world. Someday we may graduate away from that, but this definition of insanity does help to understand our case here. Now, the etheric vital body is a special case. It is more developed than the other inner higher vehicles. The desire body and the mind are extremely fluidic, and it's impossible because their fluidity and flowing, the different regions flowing into each other, it's difficult to separate them. On the other hand, the dense physical body is so well defined and integrated that you can't separate the regions of it either. Because if you separate the regions of it, you disintegrate the form. You can't turn the physical body into the solids, liquids, and gases that compose it without destroying the form. But the etheric vital body, there you can separate the various regions. And the process of doing that is called stratification. And it is important to know where and how it is done. Now, as I understand it, which is certainly not the final word in it, stratification is permanent. But in most cases, a voluntary, resonant reintegration is possible. But everything is different from that point on. All right. It'll be a little clearer as we go on. Now, if the stratification is between the three highest ethers of the vital body and the lowest or chemical ether, the result is that what is left behind is a mineral human being. It's not like rigor mortis, where the complete vital body is gone, but because there's still, the chemical ether which holds the form together is still there, and there's some fluidity in that. And what it usually is some kind of degenerate disease. And the degenerate disease is accompanied by an extreme of materialism of some kind or another. Since everything in the inner worlds is done by resonances and vibrations and things like that, whereas the manifestation in the physical world or the chemical subdivision of the physical world is chemical, vibratory things can bring this about. That is to say, certain types of breathing exercises can cause a stratification that separates the three higher ethers from the one lower ether, and the effect is the same no matter what your intent is. Now, stratification between the two higher ethers and the two lower ethers is usually desirable. However, it is only so if there is an abundance of the two higher ethers and there is an organization of the two higher ethers and an ability to put one's consciousness into the higher ethers apart from the physical body. We remember that the two higher ethers are called soul ethers, and they deal with sense perception, thought propagation, not creation, thought propagation, and memory, and communications of desire influences into the physical world. Now, the desire body and the concrete mind are also vehicles of consciousness, and they're not only more fluidic, they have much less evolutionary development behind them. As a consequence, they're not very well organized, and they're not really good vehicles of consciousness. Someday, they will be very wondrous vehicles. But at this time in our human evolution, they're just too unstable and too immature to be of much use. For this reason, the two higher ethers are the vehicle of choice when you leave the dense physical behind. So if you stratify between the two higher ethers and the two lower ethers, you leave behind the biological ethers to take care of the body, the mind to shop, while you go off into the higher worlds with the higher ethers as your vehicle of consciousness, because you can be awake in it. So, leaving the the dense body in the soul body is not insanity, because you can come back and you can reintegrate. But such a person who has made, and even in the smallest amount, this stratification is called a sensitive. And that sensitive is much more aware of this world than other people. The best way to do this stratification, which also helps at the same time to build the character, is through retrospection. Because retrospection involves the same principles that stratify the vital body, the etheric vital body between the biological and the soul ethers after death. So anytime that you're doing retrospection, you're at the same time that you're working on self-improvement and that you are harvesting the events of your day, you are at the same time stratifying the body. Now, I don't know much about if you stratify the highest ether and leave behind the other three. I don't know much about that. From what I understand of it, it is some kind of a severe emotional swoon or a high emotionalism, but I don't know what to say more beyond that because I don't know. Now, if there is a complete break between the etheric vital body and the desire body, what is left behind is a vegetable human being. From this world, what you would see is a dense physical body. And it is vitalized and it's living, but it would not have any motivation. It would not have desire. It would be somebody that would be like a vegetable that would just like to withdraw and be inward. No direct thought and no spiritual presence. Now, there may be some reflective or sympathetic semblance of consciousness, but it is definitely not direct self-consciousness. This is why you have to be so careful, because there are things that approximate other things so that one seems like another, and so you have to really be very astute to know what is going on. Again, we're talking about something that is extremely severe and not at all common. There are a lot of seemingly vegetative states that are ultimately different, and they're not insanity. Again, I can't repeat it too often, is that you have to have a very good clairvoyance to know what is really happening. All right, if there is a break between the desire body and the mind, what is left behind, the outer that we see, is an animal human being. There is a vital body, and there is feeling and motivation, but no rational basis, no reason for doing things. The motivation is the residual of the desire body from before the break occurred. So whatever your desire nature was just runs on all by itself, and it does so without the curbing of motivation by the mind or by the spirit working through the mind. So this state of affairs, this type of insanity, is a pretty wild emotional ride. Again, we have to say it, there are manic and hysterical states that are severe, but are not the result of a clear break. Those people can be brought back. Complete breaks, or what mysticism calls insanity, are very rare cases. For everything else, there's something that we can do in the way of healing. The rarest of the rare cases is when the threefold spirit, the self, the spiritual ego, withdraws completely from the fourfold personality. There is a term for that, and I cringe at it every time I have to use it because there are all kinds of religious connotations about it, and those connotations are filled with judgment, horrible judgment. The term, when the threefold spirit leaves the fourfold personality behind, is called eternal damnation. It is not for an eternity with no end, but the weight, which is not a personal weight, but it's still in the consciousness of that threefold spirit, until there is another creative manifestation, another solar-like creation in which the person can start over at a point commensurate with their evolutionary development, is a long, long time. And there is some awareness of all of the others who have gone on with evolution and all of the glories that they come into while you are waiting. This condition occurs after there have been many, many rebirths in which a personality is developed that is extremely selfish. It is active, a personality that is active without spiritual restraint. Earlier we talked about the inner battle between the higher self and the lower nature. This is what happens if the lower nature wins that battle. The spirit cannot control what it has created. It has created something that has a pseudo-self nature, a pseudo-ego nature that lives for itself, and it can't be controlled. So what is left behind is an extremely selfish, malevolent entity that can only be known by people who can see. It has all kinds of mental cunning, and it just enjoys itself in the satisfaction of desire. It has no conscience. It has no soul. It has no spiritual purpose. Now, because of this cunning, it's aware of the laws of the lower spiritual worlds, and it can perpetuate itself for thousands and thousands of years. If you're interested in this, you might want to read a book called A Strange Story by Bulwer Lytton. It's much deeper than his other book called Zanoni. And his description of the withdrawal is so clear that even a non-clairvoyant is astounded by the clarity of it. And the character of what is left behind in the story is called Margrave. And Margrave is a frightful individual. Thankfully, this condition is extremely, extremely, extremely rare. It doesn't happen often, because ultimately we are spiritual beings, and in our spiritual being we do respond to the universal spirit. All right, this is all we have time for now. Next time in the astrology class we'll begin with psychological health and psychological hygiene, and then we're going to bring in a totally different view of psychology than what we're looking at right now is basically the mechanics of psychology, Next time we're going to look into the life of psychology, which is a totally different thing. Are there any questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
What happened here? I don't know whether this took or not. Oh well. Are you up for walking, or you have to get up at 5 in the morning?
5 in the morning.
Okay.